When most people think about the time Jesus lived in, a deeply spiritual image comes to mind. Wooden sandal, religious stories, supernatural events, as if it were not ordinary life, but a holy world, slightly detached from reality. But for those who actually lived in that time, life was not like this every day. At the center of daily life was not religion, as many imagine, but money, or rather the lack of it. The world into which Jesus was born was one of the most unjust economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever seen. So it wouldn't be wrong to look at this period through the lens of financial history. Why? Because money, political power, and history were in constant conflict here, and nothing was as innocent as it seemed from the outside. At the beginning of the first century, the Jewish people were part of the Roman Empire. Rome was an extraordinarily well-organized system, but its main goal was very clear: to enrich the center. Rome did not annex lands in order to develop them. It took them to extract resources: grain, flour, silver, gold, labor, work. Everything flowed from across the empire straight to Rome. Judea was one of the distant edges of this empire. It was not a particularly wealthy region. Nearly everyone lived on small plots of land that barely sustained them, not modern farms. If you had a bad harvest, it didn't mean, "We earned less this year." It meant, "We might starve this winter." And Rome did not care. Rome ruled its territories through local authorities. Kings like Herod maintained power only with Rome's permission. Later came Roman governors such as Pontius Pilate. Their job was not to keep the people happy, but to maintain order and ensure that taxes kept flowing to Rome. Because taxes were everything. They were the heart of the system. And because of this, things worked very differently from today. Today, taxes are based on income. Back then, taxes had to be paid no matter what. Whether your crops grew or failed did not concern Rome. There were many types of taxes: land tax, crop tax, poll tax, road, market, and transit taxes. And as if that weren't enough, religious taxes were added on top. So what happened if you couldn't pay? You couldn't object. You couldn't say, "I'll pay later." You couldn't go explain your situation to an official. Tax collection was outsourced to people known as tax farmers. They paid Rome in advance, then collected the money from the people themselves. The harsher they were, the more profit they made. The system was designed for abuse, and no one could protest. If you had no money, you borrowed. Debt was everywhere, but not like today. There was no bankruptcy, no debt forgiveness. Interest grew rapidly, and collateral was almost always land. When one year went badly, that's when everything began. The harvest failed. Taxes were still demanded. Debt was taken on. Interest accumulated, and if you couldn't recover the next year, your land was taken. Eventually, you became a tenant on land that once belonged to you, or worse, a day laborer. Or worst of all, you simply disappeared. This was no accident. It was the normal functioning of the system. Over time, land accumulated in the hands of a few. Large estates and mansions emerged. Growing wealth gathered among the rich, alongside Rome and the temple authorities. The rest of the population grew poorer and poorer. This system didn't just create poverty, it normalized it. And most importantly, no one trusted the system. Once you lost your land, it was gone. There was nothing you could do. Without family, you were completely alone. Debt was not only material, it meant losing your honor, your status, and your future. Jesus Christ was born into exactly such an unjust system. And let's be clear about one thing. People were not poor because they were lazy. They were not poor because they were immoral. They were poor because the system was designed to work this way. This inevitably created tension. Judea was not a quiet place. There were revolts, unrest, and uprisings. Banditry and theft increased. Rather than calling these people criminals, it would be more accurate to call them desperate. That's why, when people heard words like debt forgiveness, justice, or release, they didn't see them as jokes. For them, this was hope for survival. When forgiveness was mentioned, it wasn't just a word. It meant the cancellation of debts. The temple stood at the center of this system. Today we think of it only as a place of worship. But back then, it was a powerful economic institution, almost like a treasury. It collected taxes. It even exchanged money. Everyone was required to pay temple taxes using specific silver coins. This made money changing a routine practice, always for a commission. Animals for sacrifice were sold at prices set by the temple. If you were poor, you couldn't simply say, "I can't afford it." You would buy a smaller animal, but you still had to pay. The temple authorities stood with Rome. The high priest answered not to the people, but to Rome itself. And this is where the deadlock truly began. While speaking of faith and holiness, this system was steadily pushing people deeper into debt. Jesus did not speak from outside the system. He spoke from its very center. Overturning the tables of the money changers in the temple was not merely a religious act. It was an economic challenge. And that path led somewhere dangerous. Rome tolerated teachers to a point. It even endured criticism to some extent. But once the system itself was threatened, there was no mercy. What happened next, everyone already knows. This story shows us one thing. Such systems cannot survive on power alone. They survive through the stories history tells and passes on. As the saying goes, when people stop listening to and believing those stories, even the mightiest empires fall.